Okay. I was trying to avoid the microphone. My name is Teresa Townley. We're going to go ahead and get started. We are running a little bit late, but there is catch-up time over lunch, so I don't get nervous about that. I'm going to introduce this session. So the title is "The Right Place to Die: Ethical Reflections on the Impacts of Transportation, Relocation, and Migration on End-of-Life Care." So we have two speakers. First speaker is Dr. Domigo Maynes, who is currently working in palliative care in the Allegiant Creighton CHI system. He studied pre-med at University of Notre Dame, went to med school at Pui, Indiana University. Anyway, internal medicine at Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, and did hospice and palliative medicine fellowship at Stanford University. So he has a extensive interest in global health and early involvement with medical mission work in Ecuador, Mexico, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic. And he is the eldest of 14 children. His wife is a law student, and I don't know if they'll have 14, but he already has 2.
1/7 away.
Dr. Welie is a native of the Netherlands. He graduated with degrees in medicine, law, and philosophy. He has been at the Center of Health Policy and Ethics at Creighton since 1997, and involved in teaching ethics to medical, dental, and other health science students, as well as the Masters of Science in Healthcare Ethics degree program. He studied in 4 different countries, held appointments in 4 different countries, lectured in more than 20 countries, has a passion for international academic cooperation, and in 2012 became the founding president of a new international association called Academics at Jesuit Universities and Schools, which seeks to advance cooperation between the almost 200 Jesuit institutions of higher education worldwide, including 12 medical schools. So with no further ado, we'll get started with the session.
Thank you, Teresa. So let me tell you a little bit about the session and how we thought we might run it. It's kind of nice that we don't have a huge group. How we were worried when we heard 450 people divided over 7 breakouts makes 60, 70, 80 people per room. But this is doable, because what we really had hoped was to present some scenarios, but then hopefully have you respond to those. By way of introduction, when we were asked to organize a session on end-of-life care, we got together, Domigo and I, and actually we hadn't even met before, so this is great to meet new people this way. And even though we have a shared interest in end-of-life care, me from an ethical perspective and him from a clinical perspective, but we were thinking, well, now wait a moment, how are we going to do something sensible on end-of-life care in the context of this conference, which after all is on global health? It would be ridiculous to try to, in a 45-minute session, try to just cover different perspectives, practices, cultures, traditions on end-of-life care all over the world, because there are, of course, so many differences and so many different aspects to that whole field of end-of-life care. And right now, I'm writing an article for the new encyclopedia on global bioethics on physician assistance in suicide from a global perspective. And I'm still not done. I've been working on this for months now, and there is just so much material. So we figured we couldn't do that. And what we essentially did was, we said to one another, now wait a moment, what kinds of experiences have we had ourselves that we might use as a starting point? And that's essentially what you're going to get. And then we thought the connection between these 4 little scenarios is this notion of place. I think we take place usually for granted. We do the things we do in whatever place we're in. We are very comfortable, of course, with the places that we're familiar with, be it our own home, be it our own school, where you go to. If you're already in clinical work, the hospital you work in daily, we take those for granted. We walk into them, we don't even see what's there really, being busy with whatever we're busy with. Unless maybe you go to a new place. I could imagine that maybe those of you who are from out of town, but even if you were from Omaha itself and you moved, say, from high school suddenly to Creighton University or to UNO, you're like, what is this new place? A little bit of nervousness getting onto this campus. What's where? How do they look at me? Am I a stranger here? Gets worse, of course, if you go to a foreign country. How many of you have visited a country where you really didn't speak even the most basic language? I mean the basic words of a language. A good number of you. How many of you, when you landed there, if it was by airplane or otherwise, had this sense of nervousness? You know, I don't know this place, and our people, you know. So we've had this, and I think we're not aware that for patients in particular, a hospital, and of course likewise a hospice or a nursing home or any other such care place, is almost foreign territory. We take it for granted. We walk in there, we pay no attention to it, but for a patient, it is like a foreign place where he or she doesn't speak the language, doesn't know the people, not really, doesn't know the customs, is confronted with people who have, if you think about it, a really funny way of dressing, carrying all kinds of things around their necks and in their pockets that you don't really understand why they need it. All kinds of technologies that are awe-inspiring and, in that sense, also comforting, but also, of course, somewhat strange. Never mind the food and the sheets and the bed and, you know, the way you go to the bathroom. If you even, you know, are allowed to go to the bathroom without first pressing a button, if you even can do so, every single detail of where patients live is different and in some way foreign. But we don't pay much attention to that. And yet it impacts, of course, very much how they experience what is happening to them, and therefore also how their own bodies, their own minds respond to these places. If you were able to hear this morning's impressive talk, there is no way not to, you know, have in your minds this notion of living in a slum and what it must mean for people. One way or another, they nevertheless managed to create a life, which I found just astonishing. I have to admit, frankly, that when I visited India myself in 2013, not even having been in any of the slums, but just been in the quote-unquote, you know, wealthier part of Mumbai, still, when I was done with that 2-week trip, I was exhausted. I had this sense of being drained by the smells, the noises, the stressors, the tensions, that even as a, you know, foreigner just coming in for a couple of weeks impacted me. So, place matters. Now, this is true of anybody, like I said, even a regular Omahan, you know, getting into Bergen Mercy Hospital or, you know, UNMC. Your own hospital in your own town is already a strange place. But what happens if you actually are a foreigner? Either because you yourself are in a foreign country, and we'll have some scenarios about that, or if you as a healthcare professional move into that kind of a place. So, in a nutshell, what we hope is to kind of alert you to this notion of place, so that from here on out, you pay more attention to that, become mindful of it, and also think about ways to creatively manipulate the place so that it becomes more homey, more a place where patients can actually feel at home and therefore gain the benefits from that kind of an environment. As I said, the way we're going to do it is with 4 little scenarios. We don't have to get to all 4 of them. If the discussions just arise and all of you participate in it and wake up and share, please do so. Then we may only get through 2. And if we present all 4 and all of you are like, and well, then we leave in 15 minutes from now. So it's really up to you. But we'll alternate, and so Domingo goes next for our first scenario that comes straight out of his own experience as a clinician.
Thank you again, Joe. I just want to say good morning. Thank you very much for making this part of your life. You know, coming, learning. These are things that will serve you well, not just today, but going forward. So continue that. The patient case that I'd first like to start with is a 29-year-old male who, being that young, they being him and his wife, immigrated here to visit friends in Omaha. He's from Burma, and when he came here approximately 3 years ago, he started a job, kind of doing some manual labor, and unfortunately ended up losing his job. After having lost his job, he sunk into what his wife noted was a severe depression. He started to drink vodka and went from a couple shots a day to a liter to a liter and a half of vodka per day. When we saw him at the hospital, this gentleman was encephalopathic, confused, very agitated and delirious, had yellowing of his eyes, yellowing of his skin, indicative of what would be fulminant liver failure. He was extremely ill. So we had him in the ICU, and he was unable to communicate. So the only person that we were communicating with was his 27-year-old wife, who was also from Burma, as I said. And there were, for unknown reasons, no friends or again, they had no family here, so no friends who were coming up. It was just Rose, his wife. So the only line of communication, I'm bilingual in Spanish and English, and I was now with my hands tied in terms of how do I communicate with this patient, the family member who's his wife. And so the patient now was out of the question, but it was a blue phone that really was our own modality for having any kind of discussion. That was the same phone that the nurse, other consulting physicians, other physicians who were on the primary team had to try to pick up that phone, call into an operator, wait until you got a Burmese translator, and then try to communicate, at best. But there was something that was lost there in that coldness of this blue phone. It almost became symbolic over time, over the course of 29 days before this gentleman succumbed to his liver failure. It became a symbol of fear, sometimes hope, because we would deliver news that was good for the day. The liver looks like it might be recovering. And then things like the CAT scans are showing that there's a mass on the pancreas. What does that mean? Well, we have to maybe go in and take a piece of that out, see if it's cancer. And really, as time went on, what ended up occurring with this gentleman is the pancreas was biopsied. There was a piece of tissue that was taken out. Within about 12 hours of having that procedure performed, he passed away. This gentleman was in multi-organ failure, so this really was the last puzzle piece to see whether or not this was contributing to his lack of getting better. And unfortunately, it was not. It was not what was causing the issue. It was not pancreatic cancer. It was his alcohol use that put him into liver failure, that put him into full system failure, and he passed away. So one of the questions that I would like to ask anyone in the audience is, having heard that story, what about the story brings to mind some questions about what we were introducing in place, the things that maybe were difficult for Rose, his wife? I'm going to walk and give you the microphone because it's being recorded.
What I think about is culture, and everyone's culture is very personal to themselves, whether that be a nation culture or maybe an elder culture, family culture. But, maybe, and I'm not well educated in Burma or the Burmese culture, but possibly, by coming to this new country, this isolation, just him and his wife, that sense of isolation maybe could lead to depression. I think what's the value and the roles maybe of a man and from that culture, that society, maybe, and everyone grieves very differently, but losing a job could almost be like losing a family member. That's your pride, that's your daily routine, that's what really drives you to get up and go and do something. You're being productive. And I think by losing that, you kind of maybe lose a part of yourself or your self-esteem, which then can also trickle down to more mental health issues leading from that. So I think just the culture of the importance of having a job mixed with the isolation of not having, support from family or friends can also be detrimental.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Any comments regarding sort of that question?
to relate the fact that sometimes you can move to a place even for a short vacation time, and like a car accident can happen, and you have to die over there while you were not prepared for that because you come on vacation. Like me, I'm here for my training for 2 years, and anything can happen to me when I'm here. So the first question you should ask yourself is, I'm moving there for 2 years, what can happen? What will happen? Will I be okay to go back home after my training? Like a lot of people travel to Italy to get out the country, and they were not able to come back home to their families. Were they prepared to have it there?
That's a wonderful question, and that's something. Does anyone have any kind of comment regarding that? Where you've had the opportunity to travel somewhere, where you mentally made that thought process. What happens? What are the logistics of getting sick in this country? Because they'll always offer you this student insurance, right? But what does that really mean if you're facing something like potential ICU stay, even death?
My question would be, why did they do the biopsy? I guess my question is obviously not knowing this case, but why did they do the biopsy? My thought would be is that it seemed like it wasn't going to be of any value for this patient, and it was a procedure that they might then now associate it with the patient's death rather than looking at the chronic alcohol and stuff.
That's an excellent question. It leads into the ethics around this case. Paternalism, right? That might be something that comes to mind. Was the procedure presented in such a way that there was no other choice? Is it something that we do many times in Western medicine as the physicians, as the nursing staff, as occupational therapies, speech therapy, what have you? We sometimes, in the way that the language that we use, it makes it suggestive that there is no other option. The blue phone that I talked about that sat on the table, that was a modality that the oncologist used, the ICU doctor used, and Rose was fearful of every time that they would walk up to it, start dialing in. Was it a sense that I wasn't there for the conversation of why they decided to proceed with the biopsy, but I oftentimes wonder, was the language that was used and the body language, the nonverbals, was it such a way that it made, essentially the question was answered before it was even asked to Miss Rose? Yes, ma'am.
My comments were kind of following exactly what you were saying of if the educational level of the patient and his wife were assessed, if the language is clear, and then even the Spanish language and how many different dialects there are, the difference between Dominican and Spain Spanish, if the interpreter was actually speaking the language that they could understand, or if they were just kind of getting a general sense through this interpreter and didn't really feel like they were fully informed.
Exactly. That's one of those things that when you ask for an interpreter, what you get is essentially who is on call. And so, I'm of Mexican descent, I'm Irish, and I'm Spanish from Spain. And so that's just the only expertise that I can give patients. But I think as you grow and you have more clinical experiences and you start to even travel to some of these other countries, not just Spanish-speaking countries, countries of all different origin, like Dr. Welie has done, that makes that world and that understanding of dealing and discussing heavy medical issues or otherwise it makes it a little bit more empathetic. And you might not ever be able to truly get into the shoes of those patients and what they're going through, but being able to try to empathize and deconstruct some of those barriers. Dr. Welie, do you have any thoughts regarding some of that?
I'll make a comment from a patient side perspective. If you lived in a foreign country or traveled, as a number of you have done, particularly in a country where you don't speak the language, it's a struggle, right? It's a struggle to express yourself. You always lack the right vocabulary. You make mistakes that you're not even yourself aware of, except that you know that you're going to be making mistakes, which makes you very, very nervous. So one of the things that I would recommend to all of you, even if you, for example, in this country only know a little bit of Spanish, unlike you who's genuinely bilingual, but even if you only use a little bit of Spanish as a healthcare professional to the patients, if you are willing to make mistakes in front of your patient, stumble through it, it, of course, tells the patient that you are aware of how difficult it is to converse in a language that's not really your own. Even if you next feel forced, in order to do a good job as a healthcare professional, to switch back to English, hoping that your patient at least knows more English than you know Spanish, or whatever the order may be. At least you have now indicated that you're on the same plane. You don't just assume that everybody just should speak English and you're just going to ramble off whatever it is you're going to be saying to this patient. It makes a difference. Having lived in Europe, of course, where I grew up virtually on the border of Germany and French-speaking Belgium, we always had people speaking foreign languages. In fact, nobody learns Dutch in Europe. It would be ridiculous. There's only 40 million, 70 million people speaking it. Well, 20 if you add the Flemish to it, and that's it. So, we never expected anybody to learn Dutch. And in fact, I've never heard somebody speak incorrect Dutch until my wife, who was American, started to learn it. And I couldn't understand her, because I'd never heard somebody speak incorrect Dutch. So, in this country, we have made the mistake, I think, of, lending that incredible resource that we have of so many different cultural backgrounds and languages being present, be a positive thing rather than a negative thing. We all get hesitant to do it. Certainly immigrant populations throughout the last 200 years have lived under the assumption that you can't speak your native language and kids should stop speaking their native language and only learn English and so forth. And of course it has created this notion that that's what is morally obligated and nothing else will do. So you can contribute as a health professional if you don't buy into that paradigm and put yourself at the level of somebody who will stumble and make mistakes. The other thing that I will, since it's a good connection to what you earlier mentioned about this notion, well, how many of you, when you travel abroad, think you might not come back? I don't think most of us do, really, right? You don't think that, but you have
I do think that.
She does. I mean, and it's probably not a bad idea to actually think this. My first scenario that I'll tell you follows up immediately on that. Happens to be the story of my own father. Now, I just mentioned to you that I grew up in the south of the Netherlands, which is right in between Belgium and Germany. So, we all at secondary school learned to at least some basic German and French, as had my father, who was a classicist. And so he had learned bunches of languages. Except he was, at age 16, the youngest patient with cardiac heart failure due to misdiagnosed strep infection. Had open heart surgery, did remarkably well, in fact, and lived until his 60s, except that by the end of his life he started to be in and out of the hospital, things getting very complex. And he wasn't able to travel anymore, really, because of his insecurity and being very weak. And he had, of course, as a classicist, traveled through Europe for much of my youth. I was in Italy every year. So on a better months, he talked his, to his physician, and his physician, his new physician, she said, sure, you should go. Do it. Why sit and wait for things to get worse? Go and travel. So he decided with my mom to go to just across the border to the German city of Trier, which is actually an ancient Roman city, about 200 miles from where my parents lived. It happens to be, talking about places, also where they had gone for their honeymoon after their wedding. Except, as these things happen, you made mention of, he just stumbled, missed a step. Stumbled going into a restaurant, and the restaurant staff was kind of worried, and so they called an ambulance, and he was brought to the hospital. And initially, they were just going to check up if he hadn't fractured his hip or something like that. They weren't 100% sure about the pictures. But of course, as they started to do the regular lab tests, they found all these complicated problems with his blood values, and more generally his medical issues. His heart issues started to come through, some minor kidney failure and support, and so they kept him. And as you now know, he never left. So he started going downhill, was moved to the ICU, climbed out of that again, back to a regular room, and wanted to be transferred home, which was easy, right? 150-mile ride or something like that to the university hospital close to where I grew up and actually where I went to med school. But guess what? He wasn't allowed to be moved. Why? Well, because if you move a patient across a national border, now the infection control protocols kick in to prevent hospital infections. And unless a single room with a single dedicated nurse to just care for him would be available in the receiving hospital, he wasn't allowed to be moved. So he waited for 5 days. A room never came available, and he died in this German hospital. So, talk about place. He was lucky, as I told you earlier, that unlike our Burmese patient, spoke enough German. In fact, another providential fact, but that's a different story. I happened to be there in those last 2 weeks. And so I was there when he kind of deliriously woke up at night, and the nurse, the nurse woke him up, talk about routines, Why, I don't know. I mean, not only do we run biopsies, but we wake patients up too to see how they're doing. Wait a moment, we all know he's dying. Why are you waking him up? And he did actually ask in German, wo bin ich? Where am I? And, the nurse said, well, you're in a hospital. And he angrily responded in German, I know that, but where? I wanted to know which country it was. Next night, he passed away. So, place. It can happen to you. You're just going on vacation. Of course, he knew that some of this could happen, having been a heart patient for so long. But what does it do to a patient if you're not home and you cannot go home in spite of insurance you might have to be expatriated? Anybody who's had anything similar happen to you? Family members where, well, what are you going to do? And stop traveling? Yourselves? How many of you are going on a trip, maybe as a med student or something like that, somewhere far? A couple of you. Any worries about landing in the hospital there? As a patient? I'm just curious. Have you thought about it?
Oh, I thought about getting, minor sicknesses. I'm going to the Dominican Republic, and I've been to, Nicaragua before, and, come down with just mild, stomach sicknesses and things like that. But I'd never thought of, anything serious. Obviously go to the travel clinic, and they tell you about all these things that could happen. So you're aware of the possibilities, but, I wouldn't say it's, a huge concern at this point, but maybe it should be.
I also went to the Dominican Republic with ILAC, which is the Institute
That's where I'm going, actually.
Yeah. And when they tell you, don't do X, Y, or Z, like riding on a motorcycle, they will tell you, don't do cliff jumping, things like this. It's very important to adhere to those rules. Specifically, right before I had gotten there, there was a student who did cliff jumping. There are these 26 waterfalls that you can climb all the way up to a mountain there, and you can jump each waterfall. It goes into a beautiful pool, then you jump into another waterfall. It's just natural springs. But one of the students, when they jumped a little too far and got severely traumatized on the way down, about 20 feet, hit their face on rocks, ended up in the ICU, and tragically, I believe the patient was not able to survive to be at home and pass away at home. And so these things definitely do happen. And again, you're taking your Cipro, right? You're taking your antidiarrheals, things like that to ward off Montezuma's revenge, if you will. But that becomes a real issue in terms of what if something were to happen, or you're riding in a bus, not a motorcycle, and that bus then suddenly becomes sideswiped or something like that.
Sometimes when I think of the right place to die, it's also not even an international thing, but even within where you live. I think of a neighbor who had hospice in my home. I'm from Chicago, and he was dying of bone cancer, and even just the thought of just dying in a hospital was very upsetting to him. So having the hospice brought to the home, or even, I love documentaries, watching documentaries of the effect that it has on people who have Alzheimer's when they go into a nursing home. The difference between someone who can have a caregiver with them in their own home, in their own environment. So even like the difference between the place of your home and having people care versus the place of a facility, and that difference. And that's not even a drastic international difference.
Very good, and we'll get to exactly that point in a minute, unless there's other questions. Anybody who has? Oh yeah, good.
Sorry, just
No, good.
comment. So I've done a little basic research on dying with dignity and what it means to people, and the notion of place does come up, and it's not always physical place, although that does play a big part, but it's also a place in your life. People tend to feel more comfortable. No one's comfortable dying, but you tend to feel more comfortable if you're in a good place in your life, if you've accomplished culturally what you've been told is, you can die when you've completed X, Y, and Z. And so I think, relating the two stories, it's important to think of how Western medicine can really has an opportunity to help people culturally to maybe help them die with dignity a little bit more, whether that's adhering to a cultural value or just, even understanding the place of medicine in different cultural views.
Okay, thank you. That's an excellent point, and I would capture that under that other part of the right time to die, right? Which is probably an even more complex issue, and we're very bad at that, I think, in Western medicine. The earlier story that Domigo shared, where Chrissy Tonley said, well, why even do that biopsy? Well, it's because we don't have a sense of when it is the right time to die. In fact, in Western medicine, of course, it's never the right time to die. Because if we die, then death is won and we have lost somehow. So, very good point. The other part of that point. How many of you have been, as patients, in a foreign hospital? I was venturing, 2 people. I was venturing to guess that you did. So, Teresa, can you elaborate on that?
I worked in Liberia for a year. I got pretty sick. So what I actually was treated by my colleagues for a couple of days in the main house. I worked with a group called Doctors Without Borders in Liberia at that time. Didn't have Ebola, but was pretty tense. And so initially got better, then I got sick again. But it was what was interesting, I didn't want to be in the hospital there, and we had doctors with us, so got IV fluids, quinine and stuff, IV. But they eventually sent me to Abidjan, and I got blood work drawn at one place, but then had to go someplace else to do something else. And then we had to go back to get the results of the blood work. And I was being driven to these places, but I was walking upstairs and then barely able to make it any farther than that. And it was just this interesting kind of maze of things that you had to do to get diagnosed. Fortunately, it was, they ended up, I wasn't getting better, so they sent me back. And after about a week here, I was fine. So I did go back. But it was a really interesting and scary experience. I did have a good team that was taking care of me. A colleague at that time, though, of mine went home with raging hepatitis. I don't know how she got on the plane. Her eyes were yellow. Got off the plane and was confused. Unfortunately, somebody was there to meet her, but she could have easily been mistaken for a crazy person because your liver's bad. It can do that to you. But it was a real interesting experience. And I felt like I was lucky because here I was in a country where there was no hospital for me to go to, even if I was too sick. But we were running a project there, so we had stuff to get treated.
It was walking over, and it was, of course, when we moved to the Netherlands back, actually, my wife joined me there. It was all strange for her, too, to suddenly get used to Dutch physicians and Dutch hospitals, though she never had something serious to do with it.
I can say that, I was in Haiti in 2010 when the January 12th earthquake was. I left the building 5 minutes before the earthquake where I worked, and no one survived in that building. So I was very lucky to be in that building maybe 5 or 10 minutes before. And a couple of months after the earthquake, I found out that I was pregnant, and I had a very complicated pregnancy, of course, because I had high blood pressure, and I was emotionally unstable because I was very touched, I was still in shock, and then with the pregnancy was even worse. So I was, it was a concern for my OB-GYN in Haiti, and he said if you can travel to the United States or to the different places to give birth to your baby, that was better for you and for your baby, because the health facilities in Haiti were completely damaged. We were not sure that we'd be able to save you and your baby if something happened. So my sister, who resides in Montreal, Canada, she said, I'll welcome you if you can come to my home and stay with me until you give birth to the baby. The first thing is Haiti is a poor country, and there's a lot of insecurity. I usually walk around with my backpack, with my laptops, all of my documents. No one ever hurt me or tried to steal my stuff. While I was in Montreal, in the metro station, someone walked through me, next to me, and pointed his knife and stole my laptop. So that was the first thing. I had to go to the emergency room because my blood pressure was so high that I could not even stand up. So I went back home a couple of weeks after. I went to the hospital because it was time for me to give birth to my baby. So it was a very long labor and very complicated labor, and I had heart arrhythmia, so I had to stay in the intensive care for 4 days while my son was okay. So while I was in the intensive care, I was saying to myself, is it true that I survived an earthquake in Haiti 9 months ago? I survived all types of insecurities in Haiti. Nothing ever happened to me. While I came here in Montreal, where it's supposed to be a safe place, and twice I almost died. The first time because someone pointed a knife at me, who hurt me, just to get the laptop. And the second time now, I'm here trying to save myself while I could be staying in Haiti and give birth to my baby. So there's not a right place to die. You just get, be prepared for that.
A good example of how life takes turns at you, right? That you have no way of controlling really. And of course, that's part of why we're so afraid about dying is this notion of losing control. I told you earlier that I'm trying to write about physicians' suicide. I have done that for years, in fact, as you can guess, being from the Netherlands. but one of the most important motivators for patients to actually seek assistance in suicide or euthanasia is not pain, unrelieved pain. It's a fear of losing autonomy, of becoming dependent on others, of lacking control over your own life. And that, of course, does reflect also the kind of culture we live in and grow up in, which is one that heavily emphasizes self-control. I mean, we have now 3 leadership programs at this university. Can you imagine what it means for somebody who gets a doctorate in leadership to lose your autonomy when you are at the end of your life? That must be just absolutely horrendous idea, and I could see people getting a suicide prescription just to preventively have it. And this is in fact what is happening already in Maynes. So one way in which one particular country, just as one example, has tried to, in spite of all the difficulties of creating the right place, has come up with a protocol, not come up with, actually it's a traditional protocol that's still alive and well. And some other people earlier commented about this notion of being home and of creating a home, and our last 2 fragments are about this, both about how we can create home or get patients home in some sense, which in some cases might not be possible, as in the case of my dad, or as in the cases that you were describing. But this is an insight that I gained from a colleague whom I met when I attended the Asian Bioethics Conference, because otherwise I wouldn't have been aware of it. Is anybody here aware of the Taiwanese practice of terminal discharge? Okay, so then you might be interested as I was when I heard this, that there is a traditional practice in or cultural expectation for Taiwanese people to die at home. It had very traditional religious roots, also with concerns that if you were to die in the wrong place, in a foreign place, somewhere away from your home, your spirit might not find, his or her way to the afterlife. That may not be anymore the main religious motivation, but the practice nevertheless was strongly anchored into the country that you ought to die at home. A hospital, as my colleague explained to me, is seen as a place to live. You go to a hospital to be cured. So hospitals are associated with getting your life back, whereas the home is associated with preparation for death. Because there you're around with your family, you're able to say your goodbyes. You are exactly where you grew up, in this familiar place, and it is the entryway into the hereafter. But Taiwan, as so many countries, of course, has over the decades built an elaborate and high-end healthcare system where, of course, people do want to go in order to get those cures, like anybody. So there is now this problem, as we have in this country, where 80, 90%, 95% of people say they would prefer to die at home. Survey after survey, people say this, and yet almost nobody gets to die at home. And that's not just a phenomenon here. She also showed the statistic that 80% of patients in Japan, nearby Japan, if you can call that nearby on a world scale, 80% of patients there do die in hospitals like they do here. So, what actually happens in Taiwan? Well, in Taiwan, though there is a change happening too, with gradually more people dying in hospitals, still about 50% of people, slightly below 50%, die at home. Some of them because they just never got to the hospital and just died at home. But the other thing is that once you get admitted to the hospital for a life-threatening illness, there is the option, and this is then discussed with patients or the family members, to be discharged again from the hospital shortly before you die. And it's called terminal discharge in the English jargon, although they have a more traditional name for it in Taiwanese. And the idea would be that, if it becomes clear that, you cannot be cured, you cannot be saved, you're going to be dying, they will have typically family members, since patients, of course, by this time might not be mentally competent to sign themselves. They sign a bunch of papers that this is what they want, and then they call in an ambulance. And the patient is brought with a nurse and all life-sustaining technologies such as a ventilator, artificial nutrition, and hydration to their home. And upon arrival, then all this life-sustaining technology is withdrawn, and the patient then is allowed to die at his or her house. She told me one of the tricky things is always, or one of the worries is that the patient might die while in the ambulance, that he or she can't just get there, and sometimes the health staff apparently kind of doesn't tell the family the whole truth, that actually died on the way rather than, at home, just so that, the tradition can continue. But I find this very interesting that in a country that has this kind of a high-tech developed healthcare system, this practice continues. Sure, of course, in the US too. If you insist, we will let you leave a hospital after signing God knows how many forms. But of course, it's not what happens. And it's not because you formally don't have the right, it's because the system doesn't expect that to happen. The healthcare team doesn't expect that to happen. The patients don't either expect that to happen. I think this is the kind of thing where you also need to grow up in that kind of tradition, because it takes some kind of courage to say, okay, this is not going to work anymore. You are in fact dying. Let's go back home. And I think many patients in this country, as well as in most other countries, simply don't dare to make that step, can't make that step, still vest hope in the healthcare system, and conversely, no healthcare professional is going to say, ma'am, I think it's time you go home. Instead, we do another biopsy, because who knows, we might find out something else that we can possibly treat. So it's a very different response. But I thought this was interesting. Now, the numbers are going down. Over the last 15 years or so in Taiwan, the number of patients who are staying in the hospital and dying there is slightly increasing. And my colleague, Yi Cheng thinks that one of the reasons might be that patient self-determination, like we have it in the US and in Europe, and the right to refuse life-sustaining treatments is taking hold, so that the number of patients actually in the hospital now can refuse life-sustaining treatments and don't have to leave the hospital in order to escape, from the rescue, mentality that drives most hospitals. And so it's not the case that the practice itself kind of is losing ground altogether, but maybe that there is slightly less need because they are starting to get better in creating a place to die, a proper place to die within the hospital too. But I thought it was a very interesting practice when I heard about it, and I've wondered ever since how this kind of a thing would go down in a country like this. Will we ever really offer that to patients? And I don't know whether the clinicians in the room have ever actually, offered, or those of you who are med students or health sciences students have ever seen health professionals walk up to a patient and say, we've talked about this. I know you wanted to, die at home. Most people want to. The reality is, we can rescue you. Wouldn't you rather want to die at home? So, comments? Yes.
I've been thinking this year quite a bit about these issues. I have one patient in her 90s who passed away in assisted in acute rehab. Not the most appropriate place to pass away, but she'd been living on her own, and then we didn't know she was that close to passing away. And then I've got another patient, she's 94, has lived at home her entire life, one day in the hospital, and so I started that conversation with her and her son of saying, we talk about not doing CPR at the end of the life. Have you thought about, where you would want to be? And he said, well, yes, we've picked out our funeral home. And I said, well, but before that, how would we make that plan? But I think our families have lost the skill and the confidence to take care of a patient through to death at home. And yes, there's hospice, But if they don't have a specific health problem, I just got all the forms to figure out, how does somebody qualify for that? It's difficult to get a patient on hospice if it is dementia and they're still ambulatory, or if it's just they're in their 90s and they start to go downhill. So I think there's like a whole culture of skills and comfort in having people at home with us when they're dying, and also the culture of comfort and skill of physicians saying it's okay that they're dying, or even to know if somebody's close to death. I don't know how we know that and make those changes in the right path.
Yeah, I managed to go through 4 years of med school without ever attending to a dying patient. How many of you have had family members die at home with you present? So a very, very, very small minority. I mean, anthropologists have pointed this out, that we've gotten very good at hiding death. We don't know it anymore. We see lots of it on TV and in movies. Very violent deaths, in fact, and our imagery of death has been skewed, of course, by that. But he hasn't been around. In fact, the very first person, I was not at the very moment present when my dad died, because we had taken shifts, my brother and I, to be at his bedside. So I had the night shift. He died, of course, 2 hours after I come back to my hotel. But that was the first time, actually, I was right there with a dying person. So even within the healthcare system, we've gotten very good in hiding that. And there is a sort of art of dying and being around people that, again, it's become foreign to most of us, and therefore scary, and something that we rather not deal with and leave impossible. Others.
I mean, we've touched on a lot of these points already, but I do think just as a culture, we're very bad at addressing the concept of dying and thinking about how we would want to die. A lot of patients have the mentality of, do everything you can to save me, and you kind of fight till the very end, as opposed to sort of taking control over the manner of death. I worked in a community health center last year. We had a lot of patients that were very resistant to the suggestion of hospice care, or even the suggestion of palliative care. There's a really large misunderstanding as to what that could offer a patient. And so I think, I don't know, I think it's just something we don't like to think about, and then we don't. But in the end, it kind of leads us to a lot of pretty bad situations when it comes to death, and a lot of people dying in circumstances they probably wouldn't have chosen, had they taken the time to sort of step back and think through kind of their values and their goals of care before kind of the onset of death.
Excellent point indeed. And so, I haven't been in the back of the room yet, so I thought I hadn't go up.
I found it interesting as we started this talk by talking about place and physical places where people die, but to me, as you've been talking, it seems like the hurdles are more space related and creating space for conversations about death, creating space for understanding about what different places might mean. Because it seems like we have a lot of, at least within a Western biomedical context, we have a lot of the logistics figured out for allowing people to die at home and able to choose a place if it's a chronic illness, not necessarily acute in a foreign country. But it seems to me that what we need to work on is creating space for the conversation, for people to make informed decisions, and for family members to understand what that means. So I think it's just an interesting.
Yeah, very good point. Space. I wanted to see the time tick away. I wanted to hand the mic for our final fourth scenario, because it's just a great way to show how maybe in this case space is the better term to use than place. How within a place, in this case a hospital, a high-tech hospital, space was created to very creatively to enable a person some homeliness of what he had been hoping for right before dying. So why don't you end our session with that?
Thank you, Joseph. So this case is essentially a 92-year-old gentleman who was fighting metastatic cancer that had spread from his colon to many parts of his body. This is over at Stanford University, and this gentleman was American, and he and his family were looking forward to the eldest daughter's wedding. And the wedding was going to be several months down the road. And we asked him, what are you hoping for? It's a very open question. What are you hoping for? And his tears welled up in his eyes, and he said, I want to see my daughter get married. And to see just, his family break down, and his daughter and son-in-law to be, it still moves me, and that was like 5 years ago. But a blessing came about. Stanford University, they got around all the red tape and such, and were able to make a space. They were able to get a private room for the gentleman, close off part of the ward, just a very small part, so that they could bring the wedding and have it moved up from months and what it would have been, and to have a beautiful ceremony. It was televised. The patient was aware and cognizant of everything that was going on, and he passed away the day after. But to see that the space was created earlier in his hospitalization to talk about what he was hoping for, getting those things, the adverse effects of having these discussions are many times myths. They're not really, we say, we might take away hope from the patient. We might cause them to have a severe depression or breakdown. But it's more, I think, that we are afraid to have that conversation. It's our fear as clinicians, our fear as a healthcare team to open that space up because of what it might do to you, how it might transform you. And if we're going to do things in the best interest of our patients, we need to be able to try to continue to open up our mind to those types of things, and take away our own fears. And so for this family, they couldn't sing more praises over the way that the wedding was able to take place and be televised. They gave a legacy DVD. It was very beautiful. So it's not all doom and gloom. Okay, so in the United States, we are afraid of dying. We're kind of death allergic. We don't want to talk about it. But just to very brief informational about palliative care, it's concurrent care, meaning care that continues as you're trying to get cured. And if at a certain point in time the prognosis or your life expectancy is 6 months or less, based upon clinical experience, different markers, you then would qualify for hospice care. But it's very much the basic concept of how can we preserve your dignity, how can we give you a good quality of life so that way you live up to the last moment of your life with what is in your heart, what your family and you are hoping for. So ask that, what are you hoping for? You will see things come out that you may not have been prepared for, that are great.
Thank you. I think time-wise.
Thank you very much.
Well, we'll officially close this session. Thanks so much for Dr. Welie and Dr. Maynes to take this time to discuss these issues with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Another round of applause.